Being Different, Chapter 1, Different. Anne Potter was a strange girl. She had deep red hair falling down to her waist as she looked out the window from her bedroom. She was nearly 11 years old, but was slight for her age, and her face was covered with freckles. She was wearing one of her brother's old Quidditch jerseys as she stared out the window. She didn't like Quidditch, but the top was comfortable, warm without being too heavy. She had always been different, even before her parents died. She was quiet, too quiet. Even when they were babies, her brother would zoom around the house on his tiny broomstick while she played with her rag doll. And then, of course, Harry had become the boy who lived, as they called him now. Anne was shunted to the background, not by her family or by the people who knew her, but by the Wizarding world. They were always so busy worshipping Harry that they never noticed little Anne. She was watching her brother out the window. He was playing Quidditch with Ron, Ginny, and Fred and George Weasley. Fred and George had come home from Hogwarts the day before, and had been playing Quidditch in the garden all afternoon. Anne didn't want to go and join them or anything, but she sometimes wished that she did want to go join them. That she was more normal. Uncle Remus had worried about how different she was, even when she was a little girl. She didn't have any friends, and she liked to keep to herself. She would rather read a book than actually talk to people. As she got older, she began to get nervous at the slightest thing. Any sudden noise would make her panic. Eventually, they took her to a child counsellor when she was 8, because Uncle Remus and Uncle Sirius were worried that there might have been something wrong with her. The counsellor told them that there was nothing physically wrong with Anne. She had what was called an antisocial disorder, more specifically, Asperger's syndrome. This meant that Anne was very introverted and would never have very many friends. It also explained why Anne's magic lashed out when she got upset at things. She had learned to control her magic, but her emotions could sometimes be erratic. She also had very high levels of anxiety. She would get scared if there was a loud noise from another room. Her head would start to throb and she would start to panic whenever anybody shouted, even if they weren't shouting at her. Her anxiety was another thing that made her different. She lived in a house full of Gryffindors, the house of the brave. Remus had been in Gryffindor, Sirius had been in Gryffindor, her parents had been in Gryffindor, and so were all the Weasleys. It was clear, too, when you looked at Harry, energetic, sociable, always standing up for his friends, and particularly Anne, that he too would be a Gryffindor. But someone so nervous and shy as Anne didn't belong there. She wasn't brave. Anne was sitting on the window seat in her bedroom with her knees pulled up to her chin. She often sat like this, when she was upset, when she was nervous, when she was thinking, sometimes doing nothing at all. Anne had very erratic emotions, which started to show through just after she turned 4. Fortunately, for her family, Luna's family had given Anne a necklace for her 4th birthday, which could change colour depending on her emotion. Anne couldn't always verbally explain her feelings, and her change in emotions was so sudden that Anne always wore it to help her family understand her better. Everyone who knew Anne well enough knew what the colours meant. Bright yellow meant she was happy, blue meant she was sad, red meant she was angry, purple meant she was confused, orange meant she was shocked or scared, pink meant she was thinking. Anne thought a lot, so her necklace was quite often the light pink like it was showing at the moment. Anne was just about to levitate over a book when she heard a knock on the door. Anne was startled as she suddenly flashed her head away from the window. There was another light knock. Come in?" she stammered quietly. "Hello, Anne," said Percy as he stood in the doorway. "Oh, hello, Percy," said Anne as her necklace quickly flashed back to yellow. "How was school?"
"It was great. I think I'm really ready for my OWLs now."
Percy was Anne's favourite Weasley, and apart from Luna and Harry, he was the only really close friend she had. Percy liked to talk about a lot of things, especially himself, and Anne was a particularly good listener as she didn't tend to talk much or interrupt him. Percy had always liked Anne from the moment when they first met, because they had both been quieter than the others and had a shared love of books. Percy had grown out of his shyness and become pompous and bossy, but he had a good heart, and he had always had a soft spot for Anne. If she occasionally wandered off into a world of her own whilst he was talking to her, he didn't mind, because he knew she couldn't help it. The dreamy aspect of Anne was part of her charm. She was named after Anne Shirley from Anne of Green Gables, and it wasn't just that their hair colour that they shared. Anne Potter, like Anne Shirley, had always had a vivid imagination, and her mind was often off on a world of her own. As Percy was jabbering away about his perfect marks, Anne's grey cat, Athene, came charging into the room and settled herself onto Anne's lap. Anne's lack of friends was made up for by her cat, Athene. Athene knew when Anne was upset. If Anne was crying, Athene would lick the tears off her face and let Anne stroke her. Sometimes at night, Anne would wake up and find Athene snuggled in next to her. They were so close that sometimes as Anne got out of the bath, then Athene would be licking her legs dry, and Anne would laugh because her tongue was so ticklish against Anne's legs. After a while it started to get late, and at 5 o'clock the Weasleys all had to go home to get ready for supper. Anne still hadn't moved from her favourite seat by the window all afternoon, when her brother came in after his bath. "I've been watching you," Harry told Anne. "You've been sat there all afternoon holding your knees up to your chest. You didn't even get a book out. I could see you from where I was flying," he added. "What's up?" "I know that when you're sat like that, for this long, then something's up." "What are you talking about?" Anne asked. "Something's wrong. I know you too well. I'm not just your brother, I'm your twin brother. When you sit like that, you're either upset or thinking. When you're sat like that without moving, then you're so deep off into that world of your own. Then it has to be a pretty serious problem." A small smile played on Anne's lips at how right her brother had been about her. "Harry," she eventually asked, "do you think I'm different? I mean, like, weird different." "Well, no. Well, I mean, yes, you're different, but what's the harm in that?" Harry answered. "But I mean, you've always been different. Besides, what's the fun in being normal?" He laughed. "But you're still worried about something?" "I'm worried we won't be sorted into the same house when we get to Hogwarts. You and Ron are probably going to go into Gryffindor, but I know I won't." "Oh, I see," answered Harry. "I've been thinking that a bit too recently. I mean, come on, sis, you learnt to read when we were 3. Typical Ravenclaw if I ever saw one." Anne blushed. "But what if I don't have any friends? What if everyone thinks I'm weird?" "They won't, don't worry. Besides, if you don't make any friends in your first year, Luna will join you the year after, and she's a typical Ravenclaw too. You'll be fine, sis." Anne was still worried, though. She went downstairs for dinner, where they were having shepherd's pie with peas. Anne, however, hardly touched it. She just pushed the potatoes around with her fork. She didn't even touch her ice cream. Anne trudged her way upstairs after dinner and changed into her pyjamas. She then sat under her duvet with her knees pulled up to her chest. She was worried that Harry and her were going to grow apart. She knew she was different, and that people who were different tended to get bullied. She hadn't been to school, but had learned at home with Uncle Remus and Harry. She was terrified. A whole school full of hundreds of people. And if Harry and she were in different houses, they would hardly see each other. Remus and Sirius asked Harry if he knew what was wrong once Anne had gone upstairs. She's worried about school, Harry admitted. Houses, friends, fitting in. She's got nothing to worry about. Well, actually, Harry, she does. Don't forget you already have friends in Ron and the Weasleys, said Remus simply. Your sister is different and quiet, but most importantly, she's vulnerable, Sirius continued. It's the weak and the vulnerable that get picked on. Your sister may be bright, but she is, unfortunately, both weak and vulnerable, Remus added. We haven't wanted to say this, but I and Sirius have been discussing it for a while. Whatever house you two are put into, you need to promise me now that you will protect and look after your sister. She won't survive the first term if you don't help her, Sirius finished. Harry nodded. I'll look after her. I promise. I always have. Always will. When Remus went upstairs a while later, he found Anne, her knees curled up to her chest under her duvet. Her face was covered in tears, but she was already half asleep. Remus placed his arm behind her back and lay her down and then tucked her in. You'll be all right, Anne. Harry's going to look after you. Promise? She said very drowsily and teary. I promise, he said, kissing her on top of the head.